The original God of War game was released in 2005 for the PlayStation 2. It would go on to grow into one of the biggest franchises in gaming, spanning several sequels across many consoles and eventually leading up to the 2018's quote-unquote reboot of the series. God of War games have always been praised for their over-the-top yet carefully crafted action gameplay. Over the years, I've heard the God of War franchise be described as a power fantasy, both by fans of the series as well as by its own developers. And I think that this is a pretty accurate description. In fact, the reason that God of War games eventually lost their appeal to me was because they seemed to be nothing but a power fantasy, and a very traditionally male power fantasy at that. Which is not to say that the old God of War games didn't have any interesting stuff going on narrative-wise. I always loved taking in and exploring the worlds in these games. I still have vivid memories of Pandora's Temple from the first game, or of climbing the massive chains leading up to the Steeds of Time in God of War 2. And I have always been captivated by the depictions of the underworld in many of the entries of the franchise. And in terms of the storytelling, there are also moments when the story actually manages to build up to compelling sequences with emotional or thematic depth. The end of the first God of War stands out to me, for example, where we see Kratos having to fend off shadows of himself as he comes to terms with the sins of his past. And I love the way in which Kratos' anger becomes a force that literally brings about the end of the world in God of War 3. But at its core, the franchise as a whole always felt to me very shallow. A power fantasy, yes, but an empty one that seemed to have young male gamers as its main target audience, which I imagine is probably pretty accurate. Kratos was always depicted in a very shallow, very stereotypically male kind of way. His main character trait was that he was pissed off at everything. Well, that and that he was so manly he could just punch his way out of any situation. Which is not necessarily a bad setup for a story, except that the games never really tried to complicate this narrative, and when they did, they never quite succeeded. After being tricked into killing his own wife and child in the first game, Kratos decides to literally go and beat the hell out of everyone. As it turns out, he's so strong that there's never any real stake in the story. Playing the old God of War games, I never once felt like Kratos could lose any fight, and I never felt like it would even matter if he did. God of War 3 was the first game that I remember really tried to complicate Kratos' story a bit. In this game, Kratos' rage becomes an uncontrollable force that not only consumes him but also ends up bringing about the apocalypse of his world. And this is admittedly a very interesting premise, but the game never really goes anywhere with it. God of War 3 also introduces a character named Pandora, who becomes a kind of surrogate child for Kratos, the point of it being to build up towards a moment at the end of the game where Kratos is forced to make a choice: let go of his rage and save Pandora, or sacrifice her in order to complete his revenge against Zeus. But this choice doesn't really feel organic. It never feels like Kratos is emotionally torn about this choice at all. It never feels like Kratos could really choose to save Pandora, not when we still have to go through a required multi-phase final boss fight against Zeus. Now, full disclosure, I played through most of the God of War games many times when I was younger, but I will admit that I haven't played most of them in a really long time, with the exception of God of War 3. So, I'm sure that there's a lot to their stories that I just don't remember, and I'm sure that there are people out there who can and have delved into the stories of these games and who could lay out a more complex level of depth to their narratives. What I'm trying to say is that by the time the 2018's reimagining of God of War came out for the PS4, I had personally and absolutely lost any interest in the franchise to even care about it. In fact, I had no plans to play the game at all. The only reason I ended up playing it was because my brother gave it to me as a gift on Christmas, and I thought, well, since I already have it, then might as well. But in the end, I'm glad I did play it, because I think that the 2018's soft reboot of God of War is one of the most creative reinventions of a popular franchise that I've ever seen. 2018's God of War continues on with the storyline established in previous titles. So, the game is only a reboot in a spiritual and mechanical sense. The setting of the game has been moved from the world of Greek mythology, which Kratos brought to an apocalyptic demise at the end of God of War 3, to that of Norse mythology, with a fresh cast of characters and places to explore. Combat has been reimagined too. The top view camera from previous games has been changed to a tighter three-person camera behind Kratos' back, which affords a more grounded and visceral feel to the gameplay. There is also a stronger emphasis on storytelling, with a very noticeable shift in the tone and the style in which the story of this game is crafted. And I think that one of the reasons that this overall shift in gameplay and narrative style works so well is precisely because 2018's God of War doesn't try to hide its connections to its predecessors. Quite the opposite, the game tackles the history of previous games head-on and uses it to subvert players' expectations. The shift in the story's tone and style can be felt right from the opening cutscene of the game, in which we see Kratos performing the deceptively simple task of chopping down a tree. Every time Kratos swings his axe, he grows more and more angry, until the point when he is so overwhelmed by that anger that he chops the tree clean with a furious strike. Anger is a central theme of previous games, and the image of Kratos chopping down this tree taps into that history. And yet, we can tell right away that there is something different about Kratos' anger during this cutscene. There is a new underlying emotional drive to Kratos' actions. In other words, we can sense, even in this brief moment, that there is an emotional depth to Kratos' anger that was not present in previous incarnations of the character. We learn later during this cutscene exactly what this underlying emotional drive is. Kratos has just lost a loved one. Kratos is mourning. So, the game first sets up the theme of anger, tapping into the history of previous games as well as players' expectations, and then it subverts those expectations by adding a deeper emotional depth to that anger. As I mentioned before, however, the overall narrative shift of the game does not only apply to the tone and themes of the game, but also to its style, that is, to the aesthetic choices with which the storytelling is crafted. One thing that stands out to me right from the opening cutscene is the very subtle style in which the storytelling unfolds. If you look at the first few cutscenes of the game, you can immediately tell that there is not a lot of exposition dumped on the player about the situation that Kratos finds himself in. Instead, the story lets us slowly take in the specifics and nuances that are at play through Kratos' actions and emotions, as well as through the organic interactions between Kratos and his son Atreus. And the style remains the same throughout the whole story. This game features a very character-driven, very show-don't-tell approach to storytelling that is not very commonly found in games at all. And I really like it a lot because I think that this style fits the premise of the game really well. This is a reinvention of God of War after all. We are delving into the underlying emotional elements of Kratos' character and story for the first time. We are unearthing the hidden depth to this narrative in a way that previous games have never done before. Not only that, but the subtle style of storytelling also creates a narrative distance that complements and heightens one of the game's most important themes, the depiction of Kratos as an emotionally distant father. 2018's God of War does a lot of work to reinvent itself narrative-wise right from the very beginning. The game taps into its previous history as well as players' expectations, and it immediately creates an unexpected shift in tone and style. The gratuitous and hyper-masculine power fantasy of previous games becomes a surprisingly quiet and complex exploration of identity and fatherhood through the character of Kratos, reimagined as a ruthless and overbearing father dealing with trauma and trying to learn how to open up to his son and become a better father. Dr. Jennifer Hayes gave an amazing GDC talk about the topic of representing mental illness in games, in which she uses Kratos as an example of a well-crafted depiction of someone suffering from trauma and PTSD. Dr. Hayes points out that Kratos exhibits symptoms of trauma in the form of irritability and hostility, destructive behavior, flashbacks, and emotional detachment, all of which ultimately and negatively impact his relationship with his son. In the 2018 God of War, we learn that Kratos has very recently undergone a traumatic event, the death of his partner, but I'd argue that Kratos' trauma is also deeply rooted in his past, that is, in the events of the previous games. And this is why I think it was brilliant on the part of the developers to decide not to fully reboot the series, opting instead for a soft reboot that allowed for a fresh take on the God of War series as a whole, as well as on Kratos as a character specifically, while also affording them to dredge up the history of past games in order to complicate and deepen the whole mythology of the franchise. And yet, During my first playthrough, there was one moment early on during the game where all of this coalesced for me, a moment where everything clicked into place. The history of past games, the expectations that I had as a player about the franchise as a whole, the narrative and emotional shift of this new game, the reinvention of Kratos as a deeper, more complex character. It all came together and created one of the most memorable moments I've had in a game in recent years. I think that the moment God of War truly reinvents itself is during the boss fight against the Stranger. The God of War games have a kind of tradition. They like to start off in the most explosive, over-the-top, epic way possible. God of War 2, for example, begins with a massive, multi-phase boss fight against the Colossus of Rhodes, which, after being brought to life by Zeus, engages with Kratos in a non-stop action set-piece that just keeps on going, even as war rages on and the city of Athens burns in the background. Likewise, God of War 3 begins with a massive set-piece in which Kratos helps the Titans launch a full-scale assault on Olympus, culminating in an over-the-top boss fight against Poseidon. The early boss fight against the Stranger in 2018's God of War carries on with this tradition. The fight itself is very cinematic, over-the-top, epic and long, but as with everything else, this game plays off on the conventions of previous games and expands upon them by adding a deeper, more complex emotional drive to the narrative that was not present in past titles. And we can see this not only in the fight itself, but also in the cutscene leading up to it.
Inside, boy.
It's not fair.
You lost control.
That thing was trying to kill us. It's not like you don't get angry in a fight.
Anger can be a weapon. If you control it, use it. You clearly cannot. When you...
I haven't been sick in a long time. I'm better now.
Fine. Come on then.
You want me to hit you?
I want you to try.
Ow! What are you...
Try again.
Why are you doing that?
Too slow. Try again.
Cut it out!
Weak. Again. Again.
Stop it!
Again! Your anger. You can get lost in it. The path ahead is difficult. And you, Atreus, are clearly not ready.
What was that?
Quiet.
Come on out! There's no use hiding anymore. I know who you are.
What's going on? Do you know him?
More importantly, I know what you are.
Boy, beneath the floor. Now!
But you told me never to go down there. Who is that?
I do not know.
What's he talking about?
I do not know. Get in.
There's Just tell me what I want to know. No need for this to get bloody.
I thought you'd be bigger. But you're definitely the one. Long way from home, aren't you?
What do you want?
Oh, you already know the answer to that.
Whatever it is you seek, I do not have it. You should move on.
And here I thought your kind was supposed to be so enlightened, so much better than us, so much smarter. And yet you hide out here in the woods, like a coward.
You do not want this fight.
Oh, I'm pretty sure I do.
Leave my home.
You are going to have to kill me for that to happen.
I warned you.
Finally.
You would not listen.
Fine. My turn. How incredibly disappointing.
Come on, then.
After picking up the ashes of his dead partner, Kratos goes inside his cabin and has a very significant interaction with Atreus. Kratos tries to lecture Atreus about anger, specifically about the danger of losing oneself to anger. Much in like the opening sequence of Kratos cutting down the tree, the game brings in the theme of anger, calling back to the long history of past games, but then it immediately subverts that history. The calm Kratos that we see here, who eloquently attempts to teach his son a deep lesson, is not the same Kratos of previous games. This very short exchange not only lets us see how much Kratos has changed as a character, but it also drives home the shift in tone that the story of this game is trying to set up. Kratos' lesson gets out of control, however, when, in his effort to teach something to Atreus, he becomes overly aggressive, to the point that his actions towards his son grow borderline abusive, something that we've already witnessed happen time and again during Kratos and Atreus' hunting trip before this. Even by this early point in the story, we already understand the central conflict of the narrative. Kratos may not be the same character, but he is still flawed. He is not a good father. In fact, he hasn't been a father to Atreus at all. He is emotionally distant and abusive. He doesn't know how to open himself up, doesn't know how to connect with his own son. We see this play out in this cutscene as Kratos' attempt at giving a lesson devolves into a mess. So, what this cutscene does is reinforce the emotional stake of the narrative. It shows us once again that Kratos' relationship with Atreus is what lies at the center of the story. And it is crucial that the player has this in mind, because the second purpose of this cutscene is to set up the upcoming boss fight. It is precisely at this point that father and son are interrupted by a loud noise just outside their cabin. What follows is one of my favorite moments in all of gaming. What follows is the single interaction through which, at least in my mind, God of War manages to fully reinvent itself. A man begins pounding on the cabin's door. Kratos scrambles as he quickly gets Atreus to hide under the floorboards, displaying an uncharacteristic hint of fear in his actions. Then he opens the door and confronts the stranger. Once outside, Kratos tells the stranger to leave his home. The stranger won't back down, however. He is clearly intent on picking a fight. Kratos restrains himself, trying to avoid escalating things at all costs, something that is, once again, very uncharacteristic of him. The stranger then slaps Kratos on the face, but Kratos continues to refuse to take the stranger's bait. Eventually, Kratos' attempts at avoiding confrontation prove useless when the stranger begins punching him. Kratos blocks his attack, sucks him on the face, and sends him tumbling down. And then, something really subtle but really powerful happens. Kratos looks back towards the inside of the cabin, a small action that is full of meaning as it lets us know that even now he is worried about Atreus. He then grabs the stranger by the arm, but even at this point, Kratos remains non-confrontational. It is only when the stranger hits him with such force that he is literally sent flying and crashing behind the cabin that Kratos finally realizes that avoiding conflict is not a possibility, and the boss fight begins. The interaction between Kratos and the stranger is brilliantly crafted. The pacing, the tension, the mystery, the dialogue, everything about it hooks you in and doesn't let go. But the reason this scene stands out to me is because this is the moment where, at least in my personal experience of the game, God of War as a whole manages to become something greater than the collective history of its predecessors. This moment plays with players' expectations in a very smart way, so much so that I love looking up Let's Plays and reaction videos on YouTube just to see people react to it. I love watching people's jaw drop when the stranger slaps Kratos on the face. If you've played previous God of War games, then you know that you just don't slap Kratos on the face. And yet, even more surprising than the slap itself is Kratos' reaction to it. How he just takes it and tries to avoid escalating conflict at all costs. But subverting players' expectations is only a part of the way in which this scene, as well as the following boss fight, take the long history of one of gaming's most popular franchises and transforms it into something new. As I mentioned in my brief analysis of the game's opening cutscene, God of War sets up a shift in tone right from its very beginning. The game then continues to build upon this through the interactions between Kratos and Atreus as they go out hunting deer. The cutscene leading up to the fight against the stranger then takes all of this narrative work and uses it to create a powerful emotional drive for the upcoming boss fight, but ultimately, the reason it works so well is because of the careful way in which this cutscene is crafted. Every moment in this sequence leads to the next one with intent and keeps building on the already growing tension. Once again, let's look at the cutscene. We begin with Kratos' lesson in anger, which not only reinforces the ways in which Kratos has changed as a character, but also reminds us of the central emotional stake of the story, Kratos' role as a parent. With this fresh in our minds, the stranger arrives. We see Kratos show fear and worry as he tells Atreus to hide, qualities that seem almost jarring coming from him if you've played the previous God of War titles. Once Kratos goes outside, he's restrained, and the way in which he tries to avoid escalating the conflict again feels jarring for fans of the series. Then the stranger slaps Kratos, causing the collective jaw of the entire internet to drop in awe. Amazingly, even after this, Kratos remains non-confrontational, and then comes a moment that gave me chills the first time I watched it. After Kratos catches the stranger's fist and sends him tumbling back with a single punch, he looks back into the cabin. And that right there, that look to me was so powerful. The reason Kratos looks back is because, unlike pretty much any other time in the entirety of the God of War franchise, he is scared. Kratos is scared for Atreus. For the first time, Kratos is afraid to lose. For the first time, there is a real and powerful emotional stake in a boss fight in God of War. This is why, to me, this moment is the one where God of War finally manages to truly reinvent itself. If you've played previous titles in the series before watching this scene, you just keep waiting for the moment Kratos will explode at the stranger and violence will ensue. But in a fascinating twist, that moment just never arrives. Kratos does everything in his power to avoid getting into a fight. What does eventually arrive is the player's realization that for the first time, Kratos has something to lose, that he, in fact, has everything to lose, hinted at it beautifully by that subtle action of Kratos looking back into the inside of the cabin for just a moment. As I mentioned before, the fight against the stranger itself is long, brutal, and over the top, but it is also unlike anything that I have experienced in any of the previous God of War games. At one point, the stranger figures out that Kratos is hiding someone away inside the cabin, and as the fight rages on, I couldn't help but feel Kratos' desperation, his sense of urgency. I felt like everything was on the line. I felt afraid, for the first time in a God of War game, of the fact that Kratos might lose. After dropping a huge stone pillar on top of the stranger, seemingly defeating him, Kratos limps away in pain. He looks tired, defeated, overwhelmed. He looks like he is barely hanging on. In other words, Kratos looks vulnerable in a way in which I had never seen before, and then the stranger emerges from the stone and the fight goes into yet another grueling phase. When Kratos finally manages to defeat the stranger, there is no sense of victory at all. Quite the opposite, actually. Kratos gets up and begins limping again back towards the cabin. He is obviously in physical pain, but he is also emotionally exhausted. As he walks, he speaks aloud to Faye, his partner and Atreus' mother. He wonders about who the stranger was, about why he was there. He worries about the safety of Atreus, and he admits to himself that he is not prepared for the journey to come. He is mourning, devastated, broken, lost, and he's not prepared to be a father. He barely knows his son. "I can't do this without you," he says to Faye. This is the emotional tone that the game begins with. This is the complex and emotionally deep narrative that the game sets up. This is the moment one of gaming's greatest franchises reinvents itself.
Boy.
There was so much. I thought. You're all right.
I am all right. Come. Gather your things. We are leaving.
Thought I wasn't ready.
You are not. We have no choice now. Prove me wrong.
Yes, sir.